My brother gave a speech at my father's funeral that made half the room cry. He talked about sacrifice, about loyalty, about how family is the only thing that matters when everything else falls away. 3 weeks later, he tried to take everything my father had left behind. He forged my father's signature on a document that gave him the most valuable part of the estate. He just didn't know I had the original. My name is Robert. I'm 44 years old. I have one brother, Thomas, 18 months older. And for most of my life, I believed that made him the responsible one. The one who had it figured out. The one my father trusted with things he never trusted me with. Looking back now, I understand that trust was something Thomas had carefully constructed. One conversation at a time, one family dinner at a time, one private word in my father's ear at a time. My father was a careful man. He built a small contracting business over 30 years. Nothing enormous, but solid. When my mother passed, he restructured everything. The house, a commercial property he rented out, savings that had accumulated quietly for decades. He wasn't a wealthy man by most standards, but what he had built with his hands. And he told us both, more than once, that he intended to split everything equally, 50% each, his exact words, at more than one dinner table. I believed him. I had no reason not to. My father's health started declining 3 years before he died. Slowly at first, the kind of decline you explain away because the alternative is too heavy to carry. Then faster. Then, all at once. Thomas stepped in immediately. He offered to manage the finances, handle the paperwork, coordinate with the doctors. He lived 20 minutes closer to my father than I did, and he framed his involvement as simple geography. I was grateful. I want to be honest about that. I was working long hours, my marriage had just ended, and the idea that someone was taking care of things, that my brother was handling it, genuinely relieved me. I visited every 2 weeks, sometimes 3. I sat with my father, I brought him things he liked. I watched Thomas move through the house with a kind of quiet authority that I mistook at the time for love. But slowly, things began to feel managed, not cared for, managed. Thomas answered questions before my father could. He corrected him gently when he forgot details. He kept paperwork in folders I never saw. And whenever I asked about something practical, accounts, doctors, bills, Thomas would smile and say the same thing. "Don't worry, I've got it handled." For a while, I let that answer be enough. Then one afternoon, while Thomas was at the pharmacy, my father said something small, almost in passing, almost like he already forgotten he said it. He said Thomas had asked him to sign some documents, something about simplifying the estate, reducing paperwork after he was gone. My father couldn't remember exactly what he'd signed. And that was the first time I felt afraid. Not angry, not suspicious. Afraid. Because my father had always known what he was signing. I didn't confront Thomas. That's the part people find hardest to understand. I didn't call him. I didn't accuse him. I didn't let him know that anything had changed. Instead, I called an estate attorney, a woman named Carol, recommended to me by a colleague. I explained what my father had said. I explained the pattern I had started to see, the way Thomas managed every conversation with the doctors, the way he'd slowly positioned himself as the only reliable one.
Carol didn't sound surprised. That scared me more than anything. She told me one thing that I wrote down and kept. If you suspect something is being changed, find the original before anything else disappears. So, I went looking. My father had always kept important documents in the same place, a fireproof lockbox in the closet of his bedroom. Old habit. He'd had it since before I was born. Thomas knew about the lockbox. But what Thomas didn't know was that my father had given me a copy of the key 15 years earlier, after a conversation about what would happen if something ever happened to him suddenly. I had forgotten I had it. I found it in a drawer where I kept things I didn't know what to do with. The next time I visited my father alone while Thomas was at work, I opened the box. Everything was there. The will, the property deeds, the account documentation, and underneath all of it, a document I had never seen before. A transfer of ownership agreement for the commercial property, signed, allegedly, by my father. I remember staring at the signature. It looked close if you weren't paying attention, but my father had signed his name the same way for as long as I could remember. The hard angle on the R, the way the last letter always dropped slightly below the line. This signature didn't feel like his hand. It felt like someone trying to remember his hand. I took photographs of everything. Every page. Every signature. Every date. Then I put it all back exactly as I found it and closed the box. That evening, I sent the photographs to Carol. She called me the next morning. Her voice was very calm, the way people get calm when they're about to say something serious. "Robert, that signature doesn't match the others. Not even close." For the first time, I understood what Thomas had been doing. And worse, I understood how long he had been doing it. For the next 4 months, I visited my father every 2 weeks as always. I sat with him. I brought him things he liked. I watched Thomas move through the house the same way he always had. And I said nothing. Not because I didn't want to. Because Carol told me the worst thing I could do was let Thomas know what we had found. So I visited. I sat. I watched. And I waited. My father died 4 months later. Peacefully at home, which is what he wanted. At the funeral, Thomas gave that speech, the one about sacrifice and loyalty and family being all that matters. People came up to him afterward and held his hand and told him what a good son he had been. I stood to the side and said very little. I had learned by then the value of saying very little. 3 weeks after the funeral, Thomas called me. He was warm, almost gentle. He told me he'd been going through the estate documents and that things were, unfortunately, a bit more complicated than expected. That the commercial property, it turned out, had already been transferred. Something Dad had apparently set up before he died. He said he was sorry, that he wished things were different, that he knew this would be hard for me to accept. I let him finish. Then I said, "Thomas, I spoke with Carol." A long silence. Not confusion, not grief, calculation.
Then I told him Carol had been in contact with a forensic document examiner for the past 3 months. I told him the signature on the transfer document had been compared against 12 other samples of my father's handwriting from the same period. I told him the conclusion was unambiguous. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Thomas laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because he needed a second to decide what kind of man he was going to pretend to be. He said, "You don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "Maybe not, but Carol does." Then I told him that Carol had already filed a formal complaint with the state attorney's office, that the complaint included the photographic evidence I had collected, that the process, at this point, was no longer something either of us could stop. For the first time in my life, my older brother had nothing prepared to say. I want to tell you what 11 months actually feels like. It's not dramatic. That's the part nobody warns you about. It's phone calls at 7 in the morning from Carol with updates that don't update anything. It's sitting across from a notary while someone explains for the third time what a forensic document examiner does. It's driving to your father's house to collect paperwork and standing in his bedroom for 20 minutes because you forgot why you came. Thomas and I were in the same room twice during those 11 months. Both times in an attorney's conference room. Both times he looked at me the way people look at someone they've decided to feel sorry for. I let him. The first time, his attorney said I was acting out of grief. The second time, Thomas said it himself. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You were barely around at the end, Robert. You don't get to rewrite what Dad wanted." That one almost got me. Not because it was true, because part of me had been punishing myself with the same sentence for months. I hadn't been there every day. Thomas had. He had been in the house. He had driven to appointments. He had taken phone calls. He had made himself indispensable. And he had used every bit of that access. The hardest part wasn't the legal process. It wasn't the paperwork or the depositions or the waiting. The hardest part was watching my father's life get reduced to documentation, his handwriting analyzed, his mental state debated, his private conversations read aloud in rooms he never would have entered. A private man, a man who hated being discussed by strangers. I used to sit in parking lots after those calls, just sitting there, engine off, trying to remember what normal felt like, trying to remind myself that this was the right thing, that he would have done the same for me. Thomas hired an attorney within 48 hours, a good one, expensive. He contested everything. He claimed the transfer had been legitimate, that our father had been of sound mind, that I was motivated by greed and resentment. He said I had always been jealous of him, that I had resented his closeness with Dad, that I couldn't accept that maybe, at the end, our father trusted him more. He knew exactly where to press. That's what made it work on other people. A few relatives stopped calling me. One cousin sent me a message that said, "Your father wouldn't want this." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I wrote back one sentence. "That's why I'm doing it."
But here's the part Thomas never accounted for. The part he had never once considered in all his careful, patient planning. My father had also kept a journal. Not a diary, nothing sentimental. A simple record. Dates and notes. Things that happened. Things that were said. The kind of documentation a careful man keeps because he had worked in contracting long enough to know that memory alone is never enough. The journal covered the last 3 years of his life, including multiple entries describing conversations with Thomas about the estate, including one entry dated 11 weeks before my father's signature allegedly appeared on the transfer document that read in my father's own handwriting. Thomas asked again about the commercial property. I told him again, everything gets split equally. I don't want to discuss it anymore. Carol read that line twice. The first time as an attorney. The second time, I think, as a daughter. The journal had been in the lockbox the whole time. Thomas had either never found it or never thought it would matter. That was his mistake. He thought my father's silence meant weakness. It had been documentation. The hearing lasted less than an hour. I had imagined something bigger, some dramatic confrontation, some moment where Thomas would break or apologize or look ashamed. He didn't. He sat beside his attorney in a dark suit, staring straight ahead, his hands folded on the table like he was attending someone else's problem. The judge reviewed the examiner's report, then the journal, then the original will. When she read my father's handwritten note aloud, Thomas finally moved. Not much, just his jaw. But I saw it. The court ruled in my favor on a Thursday afternoon in November. The transfer was declared invalid. The estate was distributed according to my father's original will, 50% each. Exactly as he had always said. For a moment, I didn't feel relieved. I just felt tired. Then I thought of my father saying those same words at the dinner table, years before anyone in that room knew his handwriting would have to speak for him. Thomas was ordered to return legal fees. His own attorney costs had run, by that point, to something considerable. The appeal he filed 6 weeks later was denied. I haven't spoken to Thomas since the ruling. I don't know if I will. There are people who do things out of desperation, who make one terrible decision in a moment of fear or grief and spend the rest of their lives carrying it. I could find a version of forgiveness for that person. Thomas wasn't that person. Thomas had planned this for years, quietly, carefully, one conversation at a time. He had watched our father's health decline and treated it like an opportunity. The house is mine now, half of it. I don't live in it. I couldn't. But I visit sometimes. I walk through the rooms. I stand in the backyard where my father planted things that are still growing. The journal is in my desk. Sometimes I open to that page, the one where he wrote exactly what he wanted. And I think about how Thomas believed he was the only one planning ahead. But my father, a careful man, a quiet man, had written down the truth before anyone knew it would be needed. He couldn't protect himself from Thomas in the end, but in his own quiet way, he protected me.